I might take just a few minutes to welcome you and give you a bit of background about the Warner Lecture Series. It is apt that this series is named after Charles and Jerome Warner. Of course, for anyone who cares about UNK, these two were very special people. Charles and his son Jerry were great supporters of the university. Both were University of Nebraska alums with a deep appreciation for the importance of higher education to the welfare of our state. And if it weren't for Jerry Warner, UNK may not exist the way that it does today. It was Jerry's leadership that brought the former Kearney State College into the University of Nebraska system 26 years ago, a move that has, I think we would all agree, significantly elevated the profile and growth of the campus. But more than that, Charles and Jerry Warner were also true public servants. They understood what it meant to work towards something greater than themselves. They devoted their careers to public service with almost 7 decades of elected leadership between them. When you think of Nebraska humility, they were it. Each continued to operate the family farm while serving the public. Each of them was still in public office when he died. Charles and Jerry Warner embodied the best parts of the American spirit: selflessness, courage, a willingness to work hard, and an ability to get things done. They were widely respected during their careers, earning them the nicknames Grand Old Man of Nebraska Politics and Dean of the Legislature, respectively. They will always be an important part of the history of the University of Nebraska and our state. The lecture series in the Warner's honor is a fitting tribute to their legacy of serving the public good. I look forward to the topics we'll explore during the Warner series, starting with today's talk by Chancellor Doug Christensen. Again, thank you to my colleagues who helped organize this event and bring it here today. Thank you.
Hank, thanks for being kind. Well, at least not being honest. I was afraid I was going to get, we do evaluations of university administrators, and I think I saw in my mailbox that my draft came back. I had the courage to look at it. So perhaps this is my last lecture as well. I remember the introduction. That was very kind. I remember that when Jerry passed away, it didn't seem like I had a very steady hand. I wound up inheriting most of these bills, and I didn't realize the absolute quagmire he'd gotten me into. That year I picked up 70 bills and ran them on the floor that year, and that was way too much, way too long. But what an honor it is, Peter, to speak at this first Warner Lecture Series. Jerry would have loved this. And I'm going to tell a lot of stories perhaps, and I hope that there's some summary to it. There's so much to talk about Jerry and Charles Warner. It's where do you begin? Where do you end? Do you go year by year? Do you pick out certain things? And I'm going to try to do a little of all of that. But Jerry Warner would have loved this room. He would have loved to have you here. First of all, students were here. Number one on his list. He kind of lost faith with the rest of us. He still had faith that the students and young people were the salvation of the state, and he really did believe that. He would have loved to have the president of the university here. His sweet tooth was the university, and he would get annoyed with the university, no doubt about it. We deserve to be annoyed, have him annoyed at us once in a while. But he loved the university, and when the president of the university would come to an event, that made it very, very special, as it does today. He would have loved a football game. Jerry was actually part of the Cornhusker team, although it very short. At that time, I don't think you had to be recruited. I think you had to have a jersey your size, and you got to go out. Jerry tore up his shoulder one of the early practices. They taped him up and said, go back in. He had a separated shoulder, re-separated it, never played. But we kidded him. He was part of the Husker football team, I guess, in which he was. Honestly, to have staff and faculty here would have been high on his list as well, and certainly interested in Nebraskans. He loved to talk about Nebraska. And so that's where we're at this point. He would have much preferred this discussion centered on his wife Betty or on his father Charles. Jerry would not, in fact, he probably got up and leave. He would not have wanted to talk about himself to do that. And so for some people, when you talk about legislators, you start to think of members of Congress. Would you please let that out of your mind for an hour? We're not talking about Congress. We're talking about Nebraska, which is a much different environment and a much different group of people. My chore today is, should there be another Jerry Warner, and will there be another Jerry Warner? And I'm going to start my first focus on, should there be another? And to answer that question, you really need to know a little bit about him. The first answer would be, for the people who worked with him, it would be, you fools, of course there should be a Jerry Warner. There ought to be a Jerry Warner in every organization, but the state should have Jerry every day. But my guess is most of you have never met Jerry Warner. How many people met Jerry? A few. Good. This is great. Given the age the hands went up in another 10 years, there may not be. But there are far few people who have ever met Jerry. And so I think my task today is to talk to you a little bit about who Jerry Warner was and what I think this lecture series could produce as we go forward. He was born in 1927. He would have been 90 years old this year. And you're thinking, oh man, 90. He died when he was 69. Way too young. Way too young. We lost a number of good years for Jerry. And the reason for them dying at that early age, his wife was dying a few years earlier. He didn't have the heart to tell her that he had prostate cancer. So he never went and took care of it. He never went and took any treatment. He waited until after Betty died to take care of himself, and it was way too late. We could have had Jerry another 20 years easily. But because of his devotion to his wife, we didn't. By most accounts, Jerry, I think, is known here as President Bounds talked about, the champion of bringing Kearney State College into the university system. We should know him for being the son of Charles Warner. Obviously, Charles sponsored that legislation in 1905 to have a campus here in Kearney. But just imagine if either Charles or Jerome hadn't done those two bills, where would you be today? You wouldn't be here. Legislators are commonly known to do things that are good for their own district. Well, here were two senators from eastern Nebraska who did something that was good for the state of Nebraska and maybe was even in their district's own poor interest. They set all that aside and used the state's best interest to create this campus, and so that we're able to be here today. And you think of the thousands of lives that have been impacted because of those decisions. There's so much more to Jerry Warner, and so I want to give some light onto him as a person. And the first place to start is with Charles. Charles Warner was first and foremost a farmer. He would have bristled at the idea that he was a public employee. He didn't like that. He would certainly not want to have been a politician. He took tremendous pride in his Hereford cattle, and that was his first love and joy, perhaps even more than his two sons. In most unusual way, as a rancher at that point in time, he was in Waverly, that area. He went to college. He went to Luther College in Wahoo, and then graduated from the University of Nebraska in 1899. Anytime you say 1800s, I just think, oh my God, that's ancient history. It really isn't. The local political party, the Republicans at that point, had their eye on this guy. They see and they watch, and they saw that Charles Warner was an up-and-coming, bright member, and they wanted to recruit him to be a Republican. And at that point in time, the parties did the nominations to serve in the legislature. So there weren't political parties, there were primaries for the political parties that the general citizenry got to participate in. So the parties did that in their local convention. They nominated Charles. He had a great first year. He was bright, well-respected, well-educated, obviously. After his first session in the legislature, Charles went to Columbian University in back east and went to law school. Now, Columbian, not Columbia, Columbian became part of the George Washington School of Law. So Charles Warner went back to GW Law and got a law degree as a rancher because he was so interested in the process. He was so interested in what had happened to him. And I don't know who took care of the farm. I have no idea. The boys were too young at that point to do that. Obviously, they weren't around in the early 1900s. But Charles gained his law degree. He came back and was nominated for 2 additional terms, quickly fell out of favor with the Republicans. He was way too independent. He had his own mind, and he usually voted against them, and they were just furious, and so they were going to get rid of him, and they did. But the law changed, and all of a sudden the political parties didn't have to say so about who was in the legislature. The general public did, and so Charles was elected back into the legislature in 1914. He was successful in 1918, and he served there for another 20 years. He was elected lieutenant governor 4 times, and he served as lieutenant governor from 1949 to 1955. He died as a setting office holder, which was another Warner trend. They had trouble with the farm. They always were spending too much time at the Capitol, not enough time with the cattle, and they both died serving in office. In fact, the governors, if you would match up the statement of the governor in the 50s versus the governor in the 90s when they passed away, are almost identical statements about Charles and Jerome Warner, because they were very similar. So to know, you've got to understand, to know Jerry, you had to know Charles. And Charles was extremely successful. George Norris obviously was responsible for the unicameral legislature, which started in 37, but it was Charlie Warner that made the unicameral work. He was the first speaker, elected in 37 and sworn in. I have pictures of, when you come down today, here's the first pictures of Charles being sworn into the first unicameral. Jerry never saw that picture, but I had it up on my wall one day. But Charles took Jerry to everything. So here, in these early years, he was 9 years old, Jerry was, when Charles was the first speaker. Charles would have important people out to the farm. They would talk about public policy. They would talk about a wide variety of issues. And here was this 9-year-old son who was just a sponge. He didn't understand a word of what taxes or levies were, but began to observe how important people began to think about problems and how they would deal with them and what the process was to address the problems. And for years and years and years, Jerry would then follow his dad to these meetings, and he would watch how he would deal with people who opposed him. And oh, did they oppose Charles on some of these issues. But Jerry began to pick up. What do I do with people who are angry? How do I defend myself against outrageous claims? And even though he didn't understand it, he came to learn how to deal with people in difficult situations. And instead of doing his homework, Jerry's mother was always on him about not doing homework, he'd say, I got more important things to do. And he'd be out the door with his dad, going to a school board meeting or some other thing. Obviously, they weren't political gossips. But Charles knew that Jerry was destined to serve in the legislature. And so he began to expose Jerry to a wide variety of what he thought the keys were to legislative success. Can you imagine that if we had parents today who were trying to destine where their children were going to go and what they were going to do and began to give them slips of paper on how to be successful? And maybe we we should do that. But one of the things that Charles did to Jerry was to instill in him there was no answer that was singular. In other words, there isn't a right answer. That you can listen to people, you need to learn the issues by listening. Charles Warner listened day after day after day after day, and that's what Jerry learned to do as well. That if you listen carefully, you're going to see all the points of view of a piece of legislation, how different that is from today, where we don't learn, we react. We have answers, and then we find justifications for our answers. The second were that these points would collide with other points of views on other issues. Charles wasn't just involved in one or two issues, he was involved in all of them, and they would have this collision. So the people who might be in favor of roads would be against some of the taxes. And you had to learn how to balance roads versus taxes versus other competing state interests. I think one of the great things that Charles taught Jerry was that these issues are complex. They are not easy. And to be successful, you can't hold a grudge. He had a favorite saying. Jerry had this written down in a book I had. That says, what's done is done. In other words, the vote happens, whatever they do is fine, you move on. You don't hold a grudge. It became a guiding principle for Jerome Warner. It's something he used every day. He tried to pass that along to a number of us. And I think that that's not the vision that you have today of people wanting to go to war with each other politically. What a waste of time. In Jerry's eyes, that too many lawmakers would hold grudges, would hold the ideas of revenge and retribution against each other. And to Jerry, us was all Nebraskans. In other words, we were all on the same side. He was taught very early that the best interest, the long-term best interest, was obviously better than any short-term political advantage. And whether it was roads or prisons or judges or taxation, all of those were very easy targets for people to attack. They're open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They're humans that run all these institutions. They make mistakes. They can't be the guarantor of everybody's happiness. And so Jerry was left another note. You should never build yourself up by tearing other people down. Seems pretty simple, right? Jerry carried that around in his billfold. I saw a note from his father from the 30s in his billfold. Now, if we ever lost that billfold, we were sunk. He had a lot of things in that billfold. But the other observation that made Jerry Warner the legislator he was because of Charles's ability to look at new things. So take, for example, the Warner family. They were the first ones in their community to switch from horses to tractors. They were then the first ones to go from iron wheels to rubber tires on their equipment. They were the first ones in the area to go to the University of Nebraska and embrace the research of the university to raise better crops and better cattle, based on data, based on information. They applied that same attitude to government. And so, as we came into the unicameral system, Charles Warner was the one who wanted to try something new first. He was determined to make the unicameral system work. When the rest of the country said it would never do that. We then move on. Charles obviously expected Jerry to serve in the legislature. He gave him all sorts of things to chew on, but it was preparation. If we're going to answer the question, can there be another Jerry Warner? I don't see that there's ever going to be another person like Charles who will take the time and interest in his son over a long period of time. So maybe that's what we ought to do at the university, is help prepare people for public service. That there needs to be some way to educate people on why things are the way they are, and what the good public policies are, and what the options are. In other words, have important people talk about important issues as a mechanism for teaching. And that if people aren't going to serve 34 or 35 years, and they only get to serve 8 years, they need to have the previous years rich in their knowledge and experience. We can do that at the university. We ought to think about that. For so many times, Jerry would have his eye on being a public servant. He would bristle at the idea of being a politician. If you wanted to turn him red other than call him hot, I don't think anybody ever said that to Jerry. His profession was a farmer. He had a passion to be a public servant. He was not an office holder who practiced politics. And the political parties dearly disliked Jerry, both sides. Because in his idea, the political parties weren't there to govern. They were there to elect people. The people who governed were the people who were the legislators at the time. And so Jerry, throughout his career, was very proud that he had a relationship with his constituents. He was never particularly impressed when somebody would come in and say, I'm a governor, I'm a politician, I'm somebody from another state. Jerry, be polite, be nice, kind of nod and walk off. In his view, it was the office that deserved the respect. And so he liked all legislators because of the office they held, not because of who they were. He was suspicious, obviously, of people who used their offices to make themselves seem important. Way too many times did he see people who were trying to help themselves as opposed to helping the state. You would think that, well, that's being critical of the legislature. No, he was critical of the people who served, who didn't live up to their potential. As Jerry began his legislative career, his most valued asset was his university degree. He was very proud of that degree. He gained a great deal of knowledge that had opened up to him. He began to follow his father's footsteps and belong to organizations. His most solid experience was one, and you all know the story here. Anytime you don't go to a meeting, you're going to get elected to be the chair, right? That's what happened to Jerry. The local community, the legislature had passed a bill that said that the counties were supposed to develop a plan for reorganization and consolidation. So Jerry did not go to this meeting. He was interested but didn't go for some reason. Well, in his absence, he was elected chairman of the Lancaster County School Reorganization Committee. Their job was to explore consolidating 25 to 40 local school districts in Lancaster County. In other words, nobody wanted to do that. If you were a landowner by Jerry Warner, you loved the school district. Your school district was inexpensive, or in other words, cheap, and you had a lot of land value and your levy was low, so you didn't pay a lot of taxes. I want to keep it that way. Now, not much interest was paid to the lost opportunities of the students who you didn't have enough money to pay for adequate instructions or other things. They thought for sure that Jerry would do his own best interest and he would tube this committee, and they were very satisfied with that. They obviously did not know Jerry Warner. He became the clear leader. He developed a process for listening to people. Much like his father Charles, the issue wasn't to show people how smart you were, the issue was to listen. And the idea was to learn about the problem, and more importantly, to listen about their fears and their concerns, and then he could develop some solutions to those. Jerry got started, he went out, and honestly didn't think that it was going to be successful. But what he really found was that people wanted education. They liked education, they wanted opportunities, and they would be willing to pay more for those opportunities. So he developed the plan, he went out and he sold it. Time and time again, what he found out was that if you gave people the right information, over a period of time, they would make the right decision. And this clearly happened with this school reorganization. It was a basic belief of Jerry, and I think that it's applicable today to a wide range of issues. If you are charged with a problem, you're going to be judged by the process that you address the problem with. If the process is deemed and people believe the process was fair, they had their say, then the answer is presumed to be fair. He did this time and time again. It was the process that was more important than the answer. If the process was fair, the answer was fair. And on his first day of the legislature, I think it's another good example. He had some family friends that walked up. It's this doggone billfold story again. They gave him a slip of paper because they knew Charles had given Jerome lots of pieces of paper. They gave him a piece of paper from Edmund Burke. Now, if you're a student back here, I trust you all know who Edmund Burke is. For the rest of us, Edmund Burke was an Irish statesman and a member of Parliament in Britain in the late 1700s, and by several accounts was the philosophic founder of modern conservatism. Jerry would pull this piece of paper out and read it off, and it said, "Your representative owes you not his industry only, but his judgment. And he betrays you instead of serving you if he sacrifices it to your opinion. The bottom line is you elect me for my judgment. And if all I do is try to figure out what your opinion is, why do you have me? I owe you my judgment." Could you imagine that if Fox would run that, or CNN would run that today? A legislator that would stand up and say, you know, I really don't think I'm doing you a good service by doing what your opinion is. I'm going to use my own judgment. But that attitude has served this state so well over the years. And in Jerry's view of the world, elected representatives are expected to make decisions. They're expected to study and work. And if the voters like it, great, they'll keep you. If they don't, they'll throw you out. It's no more simple than that. There are no scorecards. And those elections are really the ultimate test of whether you've done a good job. He certainly didn't believe in direct democracy. Every year we would have some senator who'd come up with this brand new idea. Let's let the people decide. We can't decide whether we should have abortion notification or not. Oh, that's too tough for us to decide. Let's let the voters vote on it. I don't know if we should have a policy to ban smoking or not. Let's let the voters decide. Wow, Jerry was such a fierce defender of the legislative prerogative. Why would you do that? What question do you really ask? What about the amendments? It was a way for legislators to duck the responsibilities that they had been elected to do. And because of that, Jerry thought it was a poor use of legislators' skills and abilities. He was always there to hold legislators' feet to the fire, if you would, about their jobs and their obligations. After all of this occurred, Jerry began to look about judgment. He would size up legislators rather quickly. Karen, I think you would probably acknowledge that. Jerry could walk in, listen to a legislator for about 10 minutes, and put them into one of three categories. They were either there for the ride, or they were interested, another third were interested in something, and the other third were interested in everything. Now, the people that were interested in everything, that's who Jerry wanted to be around, and certainly would spend his time talking to. He quickly could size people up and to do that. Jerry always had a great saying that he'd lean over to me. He goes, you know, 95% of these bills that we pass, the first 20 people out of the phone book could do. And I'm thinking, we spent how much money to get here? You know, and we have all this grandiose. Well, he probably was right. But it was those 5%. That's the issue. Those 5% that were so hard to do. And that's where he lived and wanted to do. For him, politicians came and went. Who he really liked were the staff. And I think that's still true today in so many of our institutions. They are the career people. They are the nuts and bolts people. They study, they research, they execute the law. As such, when Jerry first started, the state of Nebraska really had no organized staff. He created the Department of Administrative Services. So Hank, every time you and I complain about DAS and their stupid rules, we were one of the first states in the country to have a Department of Administrative Services that had uniform best practices. We had common payrolls. We did lots of things that were way ahead of our time. Jerry found that if he worked harder than other legislators, that gave him a great advantage. He didn't have to work all that much harder to get ahead of the curve. And that was his frustration. He would spend hours. He had incredible patience. He would sit there until the last dog was there to testify. He was interested in what made state government work. He would sit and listen to staffers forever. I'd want to go home. I go, come on, Jerry, I'm hungry. Yeah, we'll be there. And we'd sit for another 2 hours. And so whether it was how the road system worked, how the tax system worked, what made state aid to schools, how was that assessed, how was that collected, how was that distributed, he absolutely would spend hours learning to do that. Most of us don't have the patience. We want the answer. We want it quickly. Jerry wanted to understand. That was a huge difference with him, with so many people. And that'd be very, very unpopular today. You can imagine the comments, oh, the staff is running the place. The bureaucrats are gone crazy. They're running the institution. Well, thank God they did. They gave Jerry the information to have a vision. And Jerry was able to work real hard and make many, many of those changes. 1967. Peter, if I'd suggest to you another topic, somebody ought to look at 1967 and compare it to today. In 1967, we had a real problem in the state of Nebraska. It was the centennial of our state, so this was our second 100 years. But the year before, there was a referendum by the business interest in Omaha, and they wanted to repeal the income tax. They thought, we are paying way too much income tax, we're tired of sharing it, so we're going to repeal it, and that was going to go into effect in January of 1967. At the same time, the Farm Bureau had an initiative to amend the state constitution to prohibit the state from levying a property tax. At that point in time, the state operated with property tax. What's the problem? Well, 2/3 of the state tax base went out the window. So if you're going to fund anything in the state of Nebraska, you didn't have any money to do that. Now, there were some people who were thrilled by this, but it was a real crisis. Jerry had a great interest in it because he wanted to fund state aid to schools. At that point, there was no state aid to schools. There was no state money going to our local school districts. So when we talk about the state aid bill, we talk about foundational aid, we talk about equalization aid, those are all concepts and words that Jerry Warner made. Those were all ideas he had. And to make this possible, he had to solve the tax crisis first. So he led the charge early on. It was his ability to shape a huge package that was put together that passed sales tax, income tax, restricted the use of property tax, created personal property tax for the local school districts. And at the same time, they threw in the creation of UNO. That's how UNO got to be part of the system. They were part of the package that year. That's what got Omaha legislators bought into this. 67 is a huge year. Probably no better. That served Jerry so well because, again, in the 90s, we faced another tax crisis that was started here in Kearney. The personal property tax crisis was created because one of our hotels, and the personal property was thrown out. And the Supreme Court threatened to repeal all property taxes. Obviously would have given us a little bit of a problem in this state because most of our schools are funded that way. We spent 2 special sessions, 2 regular sessions, and couldn't find an answer. The guy who solved the problem, Jerry Warner. He was tireless in those days. It was hot. The university controlled the heat and cooling of the legislature, so I knew that they turned off the air conditioning. I mean, that was, you could tell when things weren't going well for the university. I think the heat went up, and it was summer. Jerry had a bad ankle, couldn't walk. His ankle was swollen. He stood for, I would think, 8 to 10 hours a day on those crutches, standing at the podium answering questions, being peppered by people. His hands were raw, they'd be bleeding. But he was not going to leave because, quite frankly, there weren't many people that could articulate what was going to happen with this new tax package. Ultimately, it was solved. The Constitution was changed. There was only one person in the world that was going to make that happen. That was Jerry Warner. And after that session, he went home and had surgery on his ankle, got his hip replaced. But it served us very well that he had been through an earlier crisis. He loved roads. Everybody wanted to be, Terry, everybody wanted to be part of the road system. Because in 1966, the same time the federal government had given the states a whole bunch of money for roads. You had to come up with a plan. Every legislator wanted to be part of this. I want my road done. Every one of them. 67 happens and nobody wants to spend any more tax money. They're all afraid. No one would serve on this committee to prioritize roads because they were burned. Navi Teeman lost re-election because of the sales tax issue. Nobody wanted any part of this. Except one guy decided that if we don't take advantage of this, we're missing a real opportunity. And it was Jerry Warner. So Jerry served on the committee to make the priority. Patience was his strong suit. He listened to everybody. He went around the state of Nebraska. He listened to every parochial person who had a self-interest, who wanted the road paved to their house. But he had listened to every one of them. And he developed a series of what are the needs of the state. And he had objective ways to measure needs. It was his hallmark, long-term thinking, not a short-term answer. So Jerry would go out with the roads. He developed a system of dedicated funds. He would increase the taxes to do this. Nobody wanted to increase the taxes, but Jerry had a variable rate system that would vary with whatever the needs were that we had at the time. Very innovative. His plan is still in place today. The roads you drive on today would not be in the shape they're in if it wasn't for Jerry Warner developing a highway trust fund, a system of variable fuel tax, and the distribution of those funds, and a fierce, fierce defending of anybody who tried to steal from the highway trust fund. Now, things have changed. There have been some stealers. They haven't been punished, but they're out there. But the roads were a very good example of somebody who could have walked away, but decided for the state's best interest, I'm going to do this, I'm going to prioritize, I'm going to think long term. Higher ed was the same way. He loved the university. He saw higher ed as absolutely essential to educating the citizens. He used his own example that the only way the state was going to move forward was if people had more knowledge and more information and could think more broadly about issues. He had little patience with politicians who used higher ed as a whipping boy, and there have been a number over the years. There might even be a few today. He had a real sweet tooth for the university. It was not a blind eye. In 1970, Jerry had a deal where he thought the university should get on board. It was something called online education. Now, we know it as online today. There wasn't the internet. Al was still ways away from getting that done. But we had public education, public television. And Jerry saw public television as a way to teach the citizens and the students of the state of Nebraska without them having to come to Lincoln to do that. He was very encouraging of the concept of stay in your community and learn. And so he did that. He became speaker as well in 1969. He campaigned to be speaker on shorter sessions and fewer bills. Of course, you know what would happen. They didn't get done until September. It was the longest session ever. It was the most bills ever introduced. And so through Jerry, we now have limited sessions, we have limited days, and we have limited time to introduce bills. He hated that. But it was a logical conclusion of what had happened. He wanted legislators to spend more time, not less time, thinking about what to do. Does it make sense? Could you imagine today if legislators would go out and say, I want to spend more time doing this. I want to spend more time being in the public eye. They'd run them out on a rail. There are people who don't want the legislature to meet every year. That was not his view. He certainly thought that the more time that the legislature would spend thinking, the better times and the better results they would have. Most speakers at that point would retire, not him. He went on, served the committees. He was very key in a number of areas, taxes, higher ed, roads, as I've talked about. But his brilliance was, even if he would beat people on the floor, and he did regularly, they almost enjoyed it. They'd come over and thank him. He never tore them down. He never went after anybody as an individual. That is certainly not the case today. But that was his style. He had teachable moments for everybody. I remember one day being there, and I'm just so impatient. We've been there for hours. I've listened to the same moronic speeches. Nothing's going on. And I leaned over and said something to him. By the way, I sat in your chair. Do you know that? Yeah. I sat with Jerry for 9 years in that chair beside him. I learned a lot. I should have written everything he said down. But he said, you should never complain about long speeches and long debate. He goes, the scary part is when nobody debates. There's something wrong. When people have an open debate, he goes, at least I know there isn't anything hiding in there that's going to come back and bite me. And after a while, I calmed down, and that made a lot of sense. Jerry was not one of those guys who would go to his office when he was bored. He'd sit there and listen to everything that was said. When he'd get frustrated, of course, he'd go out and have a smoke, and then you knew when that would happen. But I think one of the best teachable moments that he gave to me, and Galen and I have talked about this on several occasions. I had a bill up one day. I can't remember what it was, but it was certainly a good bill. And I kind of had been on a streak, we've been passing almost everything, and I was having some pretty good luck and a pretty good run, and thought I was doing quite something. Get ready to introduce my bill, and Jerry leans over and says, don't think you're probably going to win today. I said, are you kidding me? I got this worked. I prepped this, I know this. I said, with a little bit of luck, if I can be clear, I think I can win. And if I get your vote, I looked at him, yeah. Well, you know what happens. I lose by one vote. And the guy who backs out on me's got a W. It's Warner. He doesn't look at me. He doesn't say a word. He just kind of punches red and kind of goes back down to his court. And it's awkward for quite a few minutes. So I finally said, okay, what was that all about? And the best advice I ever got came then. He said, here's the deal. You may want to win every time you're there, but don't you dare do that. Do not win. You need to lose in public, and you need to make people understand it hurts and you hate to lose. And the reason is you don't care as much about this bill as another bill that's going to come up. You can't afford to lose that bill. You need to lose. And I thought this was a good time for you to learn that lesson. Now, how he knew he was going to be the deciding vote, I never did. Because Jerry wasn't one of those guys who would go out and work the floor. A lot of times he would just put a bill up or an amendment up, let people chew on it, he'd pull it after a while. But he wanted people to talk about important issues, and they had a purpose. His filing cabinet was not only his billfold, but his pocket. Every amendment I ever known in life was sitting in his pocket. We couldn't take that crazy suit to the cleaners because they'd lose and the answers to the session were in his pocket. He was not particularly organized. Staff would come up. Jerry would pull out some note from his pocket, give it over to me, and said, what does it say? I said, I don't know, who wrote this? He goes, I can't remember what the answer is. But it was there. He had a drawer full of amendments. Somewhere like any other drawer we'd have. And I was always tempted to get in there and see what the secrets really were. He'd have amendments from 10 years ago. He goes, well, we may need this amendment someday. He knew where they all were. Staff would come up every once in a while and look at it and rifle through it and find, oh, here it is, and I'll take it. But it was his relationship to his constituents that I think is most interesting, that we would never do today. And this is what makes Jerry different. His belief was he was a trustee, that he was entrusted to take care of the state, and he was not elected as the king, or he was not the dictator of the state. Jerry's relationship with his constituents was one of just complete and utter honesty. Everybody knew Jerry Warner. And so all over the state, they would send him mail. At the beginning of a session, his desk would be absolutely clear. It was a desk about this size, maybe a touch wider, and there was not a thing on it. By the end of 90 days of a legislative session, you could not put one more thing on that desk because it would slide off. It was every piece of constituent mail. He didn't answer a one of them. Not a one. And his point was, why would I write them back? And guess what was going to happen? Why would I write them back and say, I'm going to take your view into consideration as I vote on this bill? He goes, that's a response, it's not an answer. They deserve an answer. 2 months after session was over, that desk was clear again. He'd written everybody back and explained what happened and, more importantly, why. And people would love it. Could you imagine today if I went to campaign school and I told them all these things that I was going to do? They wouldn't let me in. They wouldn't take my money. So that goes back to could there be another Jerry Warner? Not exactly like Jerry. Because he was just brutally honest with people and he worked extremely hard. He also had a great faith that people, if given the right information, would make the right decisions. And he took upon himself to make sure they had the right information. And so he went along. He was not very popular with the parties. He was very nonpartisan. Jerry didn't care. He would go to the Republican dinners. He'd go to the Democratic dinners. He'd say bad things about both of them to their face. But he would always stand up and defend the action of the state. And that's another thing that he's the father of. Every bill that comes through the legislature today has an accompanying appropriations bill. So I know a number of you out there have to fill those crazy things out. I don't know, Gene, do you do that for us once in a while? Fill out A bills? There's a fiscal note that comes through and you have to explain what it's going to cost. Legislators were basically responsible. They would pass a policy, you bet, let's do this. And then when the budget would come around and say, oh no, we can't afford this budget. The legislature spends too much money. So on one hand, they'd be telling their constituents, I'm all for this. On the other hand, they wouldn't fund it. So Jerry found a solution for that. Every bill that cost money had to have a bill that accompanied right after it, a bill to spend the money to carry out the action. He would argue against a bill long and hard. It would pass. It would cost money. Who would be the first person up to say, we got to fund the A bill. We're going to have a policy. Bills that he hated, he would stand up and defend spending the money for. Because to be responsible, to be accountable for people, if you're going to have the program, you've got to spend the money. That's the reason that he was, as an appropriations chair, so good. He didn't believe in starving programs. You either had them or you didn't. If you had them, fund them adequately. Otherwise, people lose faith in what the program is to do because they didn't have enough money. He had many long, hard discussions with people about should we do things. Legislatures grew to rely on Jerry, and they grew, much like Karen and I both said, kind of take one look at how Jerry was voting, because that probably was the right vote for the right reason. But what has happened towards the end was that we began to rely on Jerry because he was the foundation, he was the rudder. He was the person who'd been there for so many years. Just because you'd been there for a number of years didn't mean you were right or you were smarter. But you knew that Jerry had been there and had experienced all these things. What he gave to us was the idea of patience and listening and long-term policies. We all should be very thankful for that. Almost everything you and I are involved with in state government has Jerry Warner's fingerprints all over them. But he's not there anymore. He's not there to take a look at it. So do I think that there's going to be another Jerry Warner? Oh, there could be. They're going to have better preparation. They're going to have to come at the right time. They're going to have to work quicker. But I think there's certainly people out there who are dedicated to the state. I think there are people out there committed to doing the right things. They're committed to people to be public servants and not politicians. Can it happen? A much different question. Term limits, the public distrust in government, all are big impediments right now to doing this. So the vision that I see is that there will be a series of smaller Jerry Warners, people who are more committed to begin with to a certain issue and will spend the time to learn and to do it, and they will find a way to convince the public that this is something we want to do. And maybe over a long period of time, there will come around somebody who will take them all in and take them all as a business. But it won't happen overnight. There's no magic wand out there. But the great history is Jerry Warner's touch and the way he approached problems and the way he approached people. Obviously he had a view, and I think I would leave you with this, that there's a difference between being prominent and being a leader. If you're prominent, it's often made, prominence in the legislature in particular, it's mistaken for leadership, but they're not the same. Prominence is really dictated by public perception and by the media, about who's important. Leadership is an internal thing, about who can solve the problems, who can do the things. And leadership can switch with an interest. They can shift on a bill. But prominence has no lasting impact. It's making yourself important. There are a lot of people who want to be prominent. There are a few people who really want to be leaders. I look at Terry Kearney, for example, who could have been a tremendous leader, but chose to be much more prominent. I think if we look at today, the biggest detriment to the legislature is people who want to be prominent. And so if we begin to talk to our students and talk to our next generation about people, about being public servants and not wanting to be prominent, we'll be really well served. To me, that's the legacy of Jerry, and that's the great hope that there will be another Jerry Warner, because I really do think there will be.